First off, welcome to the Park City Preston Hollow Tea Party. We strive to educate and improve the citizenry, and where we have presidents and we have would-be presidents. They enunciate famous foreign policy doctrines such as the Monroe Doctrine, the Reagan Doctrine, and now, of course, the Clinton Doctrine. The Clinton Doctrine solemnly intones that wherever freedom and the rule of law are threatened, wherever corruption reigns, and wherever individual liberties are denied, there is money to be made. And where in Texas recently, two gentlemen, wildly offended by the First Amendment, were quickly introduced to the Second one. We're going to start. I'm going to ask Larry if he will give us the invocation, and then David, will lead us in the pledge, and then David will give the invocation.
Well, especially if you're a veteran, you know what the term AWOL is, absent without leave. And if you've been on Mars recently, our president was, absent without leave, the National Day of Prayer, and absent without leave, the Victor in your remembrance recently. So, but we're gonna honor our country as he has chosen not to do. So if you could all rise and veterans, please join me in saluting our flag. We'll say Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And our Texas pledge.
Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible.
Bow your heads with me, please. Father, we just thank you for the opportunity to gather together in a free country. Lord, we ask that you bring us candidates for the next election that believe in that freedom, that will support that freedom and promote that freedom, and increase the ability of all Americans to enjoy those freedoms, Lord. We ask that you be with our speakers tonight, to give them the wisdom to bring us the words that we need to hear about the topics they're going to discuss. And we ask all this in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right. All right, we have some people here tonight who are sort of new faces, and so I want to spend just a minute here and make sure that you know what we are about. First off, we're the Park City Preston Hollow Leadership Forum. We do believe in 5 principles. Spending money you don't have and have no hope of getting is a recipe for disaster, so we believe in fiscal responsibility. We believe that more government and squandered spending is rarely going to be the solution to a problem, so we believe in limited government. We believe that each individual must take primary responsibility for his own well-being and that of his family, so we believe in personal responsibility. We believe that every judge and prosecutor has a duty to apply the law as it is written and not as he or she might wish it to be, so we believe in the rule of law. And then finally, we believe that the people of a nation should determine for themselves which laws will govern their lives, and so we believe in national sovereignty. Amen. We do have a couple of people who are filming tonight by permission. Normally, we do not film a lot of these, but tonight it's a very special thing, so we are doing that. This is an all-volunteer deal. If you have a few extra bucks in your pocket at the end of the evening and it's really weighing you down, please feel free to put them in the hat to help pay for the room. We, of course, have had an opening prayer, but we always say an opening prayer, especially for Obama. It's Psalms 109.8, may his days be few and may another take his place. Amen. Amen. For those of you who aren't aware, everybody who is on our mailing list will get all the materials from the meeting, and this Excel spreadsheet is always in it. These links are all live links, so if you want to go and open the spreadsheet and get straight to those, you can always open the spreadsheet, click on those links on the left side of them generally, and they will take you directly to the to the spreadsheet in question. Some of you are aware that I have an exploratory committee going on to look at the idea about running against Pete Sessions, called Ramsland Exploration. If you want to see a little more about it, there is the link now to the Ramsland Exploration website as well as the Facebook page. I think Ken got it up for me a couple of days ago, and it's doing pretty well. I'll give you a 2-second report. As you know, our goal is to raise somewhere between $200,000 and $250,000 by mid to late June. We've been at this now for about 5, maybe 6 weeks. We're about halfway there. So we're still looking for support. You can either, there's some sheets at the back if you want to give with a check, or you can go and give online at Ramsland Exploration. And at the end of this deal, if we don't get our goal, then we just send you your money back and we all go home. Let's talk about who do you want managing your government. I think this is sort of an interesting little deal here. This is something that we found recently. The Koch Family Foundations and Philanthropy gave out in 2013 $7.5 million. Their managerial overhead was about $487,000, about 6% cost. That's the private sector for you. And then, of course, there's the Clinton Foundation, which in 2013 gave out $8.8 million at a overhead cost of $84.6 million. Or in other words, 91% of their total funds went to the overhead. Is that a surprise? Probably not. Real quick word on Article 5 and the state update, and then we're going to jump into tonight's meeting. There's been a lot of confusion about this Article 5 thing, and I started out as a huge skeptic. But what I have come to understand is that the Article 5 convention that they talk about is not a constitutional convention. What it is it's a convention where people can propose amendments. Certain of them will be accepted, and those that are accepted will then go back to the states, and the states will then have to pick and choose which ones they want. And if 38 states happen to pick the same amendment, then you've got something going on there. But it is not the runaway convention problem that, for instance, they faced when we actually got our own Constitution. I don't know if you know it, but when our own Constitutional Convention was brought together, they were originally just going to do a trade amendment for the Articles of Confederation. And instead, all the delegates got there and went, this is a great deal, let's just rewrite the whole thing. That's not what this is about. That's not what could happen here. And I just know that there were a lot of people who burned up email about this, and I wanted you to be aware that we are not talking about, or there is not even a discussion in Austin about having a convention where you actually rewrite anything in the Constitution or add anything. It's merely a gathering to find out which amendments and with what language 38 states would like to consider potentially amending the Constitution. Now, as far as where we are in the state, as you know, the House has considered very few bills at this point. In fact, it ended up being exactly what we predicted. Joe Strauss blocking virtually anything and everything he can, and whoever is your representative, you need to find out if you voted for Joe Strauss, and if you did, you need to tell him I told you so and don't do it again, because this is a really bad deal. I I think most of you probably know how your particular representative voted, so we won't get into that right now. All right, let's jump in here because we have got some great stuff tonight. As you notice, I say it's a special report from a world where practitioners of so-called religion of peace are more offended by simple cartoons than they are offended by rape, slavery, pedophilia, beheading, honor killings, hostage-taking, genital mutilation, suicide bombing, burning people alive, or etc. So we've got some real experts tonight. The first one is going to be Buck Revell. I want to tell you just a little bit about Buck, and this is very, very abbreviated. He served 30 years as a special agent and senior executive of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. From 1980 to 1991, he served at FBI headquarters, first as an assistant director in charge of criminal investigations, which includes terrorism, and then as an associate deputy director, he was in charge of the investigative intelligence, counterterrorism, training, laboratory, and international programs of the Bureau. He also served as vice chairman of the Interagency Group for Counterintelligence and on the Terrorist Crisis Management Committee of the National Security Council. In September of '87, Mr. Bell was placed in charge of a joint FBI-CIA U.S. military operation. It was called Operation Goldenrod, and that actually led to the first apprehension overseas of an international terrorist. He retired with the rank of Associate Deputy Director. It's also important to know that he's the chairman of the board of directors of the Middle East Media Research Institute, acronym MEMRI, M-E-M-R-I. And if you don't know MEMRI, you need to go out and look it up. You can get on their update list, and it is absolutely stunning what these guys are following and seeing overseas. He currently holds a top secret SCI clearance from the Defense Security Service, and he's here tonight to talk to us about his topic, which is terrorism, the threat to America. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our fellow legend, Buck Revell.
Is that a legend in his own mind? Is that what you're saying?
That's it.
Well, I'm glad to be here with you. I made another speech yesterday, and it seems that the activities in right next door, I live out on Lake Ray Hubbard, and we had a little bit of activity out there last weekend. I was flying in from Washington with my wife, and we came down the bush and saw all the lights and everything going on just across the road, and got home and flipped on my computer, and sure enough, I was being deluged with information about what was happening there in Garland, and actually got on to the website, MEMRI website, and started reading the posts that these individuals were sending out and the responses they were getting. So I was following it as it happened to see what their intentions actually were. And that's one of the things that we do in MEMRI is we're able to access this social media and as well as internet and other things. And if there are foreign languages involved, we translate it and make sure that the policymakers, the operators, the academics, the legislators, and anybody who's interested, and everybody should be interested, is able to discern what is actually happening in our society. Speaking of that, I always come in and if I get a few minutes, I sit down and see what the latest news is. There was an interesting clip as I came in here that I think this group would be interested in. So let me pull it up. This is from the Department of Homeland Security. Secretary Jade Johnson, quote, "We in this administration and the government should give voice to the plight of Muslims living in this country and to the discrimination that they face. And so I personally have committed to speak out about the situation that very often people in the Muslim community in this country face. The fact that there are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world and the Islamic faith is one about peace and brotherhood." Well, he's been a different world than I am. Let me give you the facts. Muslims occasionally are subject to harassment. even to civil rights violations. But statistically, they have the smallest number of any minority, well below the Jewish community, well below the other minority communities in our society. The American society has been very tolerant, particularly after 9/11 and thereafter, with the Muslim population, as we should be, because certainly, the majority of them are not involved in criminal or violent activities. But to turn around and essentially give them a blanket and say that Islam is a religion of peace is in fact defying other Muslims who are studying the issue and are extremely concerned about the jihadist activity of the Wahhabi element of Sunni Islam and about the entire activities of the Shia sect that is, of course, emanating from Iran. That's jumping ahead. I want to go back and give you a little history. Back in 1980, I was agent in charge in Oklahoma in 1979, got ordered back to headquarters, was put in charge of the Criminal Investigative Division, and had the terrorism, at that time a section, that was one of my responsibilities. The very first day that I sat on the desk as assistant director, we had a postal employee, by appearance, go up to a door in a Maryland suburb outside of Washington. When the individual opened the door, he got blown away, 2 shotgun blasts, and we got called into it because this particular individual had been a minister of the Iran government under the Shah. So he had actually been given sanctuary in the United States. Well, we did react to it very quickly, actually arrested 2 of the 3 people involved and tracked the third one, the one who was actually the shooter, the one that was dressed in a postal uniform and driving a postal truck that they had stolen. Well, this individual, I got out of town before we even got called into the case. And we tracked him and found out that he was in Iran. And not only was he in Iran, but he became part of their training cadre, of their militia that essentially formed Hezbollah. And during the Iran-Iraq war, we frequently saw clips of him where he was involved in weapons training and other tactics for the Hezbollah. He's still there. He's not, obviously they don't recognize our arrest warrants or our red notices at Interpol. And his intention, and he's come on and often you've been used in their propaganda speeches, is to essentially discredit the United States and the Western world and to get support in the minority communities for Islam, for the Shia version of Islam. Of course, out of that Shia takeover in Iran in '79, not only was the Shah deposed, but our embassy in 1980 was taken hostage. All of the staff were taken hostage. It was a critical situation for us, and we had a gentleman by the name of Jimmy Carter as president, and he really didn't know much what to do. So finally, when it got to be a real embarrassment, they mounted a rescue mission, threw it all together, and it ended up as a disaster. And out of that grew the special operations groups and properly trained, properly equipped special operators who I think on a virtually daily basis do an exceptional job. But that hung over the Carter administration all the way through. And then most of you were around then, remember that the day that President Reagan was taking office, the hostages were released. The reason they were released is the Ayatollah knew that Reagan was a different kind of president, that he was a different kind of person, and he wasn't going to put up with this nonsense. In my time there in headquarters, I got a chance to revamp several of the programs, organized crime, counterintelligence, but in particular terrorism. We made terrorism a top priority for the FBI along with organized crime and counterintelligence. Because even though there were a few terrorist incidents on an annual basis, they represented essentially a underbelly of our society that we really weren't prepared to deal with. Our laws were not designed to defeat terrorism. Our media had very little idea of how to approach it, how to deal with it. And certainly our intelligence community and our law enforcement communities were not prepared to deal with it either. We had a situation where by 1985, there for 5 years, we had enough concern on the part of President Reagan to institute a vice president's task force on terrorism. This was the Vice President Bush, sitting in a capacity of chairing a committee made up of agency heads and department heads to look at the issue of terrorism and how we should be dealing with it. We had, of course, previous to that, the Olympic tragedy with the Israeli athletes. We'd had the Achille Lauro incident. We'd had the Rome and Vienna airports bombed. We'd had a number of international terrorist activities, and domestically we had Puerto Rican terrorism, including right in the steps of the White House. We had a number of murders carried out by terrorist groups, and they were not all domestic, although some were, including radical left and radical right in the United States. But we also had a situation where we had overseas entities coming in and essentially attacking the countries they couldn't reach, like the whole situation with the Armenians, the situation we had with the Sikhs, and so forth, where they would come, set up operations in the United States because they were virtually invisible, and then strike here in the United States. But our primary concern was, well, how do we deal with these organizations that are operating covertly and yet are not only violating our laws, but essentially putting our citizens at risk in manner and methods that the everyday law enforcement officer was not capable of dealing with. Out of the Vice President's Task Force in '85, I was on the operational subgroup. We're the ones who scrubbed it and put it in the fine form and then testified before Congress. We recommended some changes. Those changes were functional and operational in nature. They were never adopted. This was 1985 until after 9/11. They were in the Patriot Act right after 9/11. They turned to those recommendations and said, oh, there was a reason to put those in law. And in fact, we couldn't do roving wiretaps, meaning you got a wiretap order for a phone in a room, and you couldn't follow the individuals that were carrying out the activities. You had to get the tap on that phone in that room. Well, that had nothing to do with communications even in 1985, which were extremely mobile, and people changed phones and locations on a regular basis, particularly in the terrorism business. We couldn't get records by a subpoena. We had to get a search warrant. We couldn't engage in the collection of intelligence unless we opened an active case rather than public information on the streets, which a student, newspaper reporter, any citizen could collect information that was disseminated on the streets, collate it, look at it, and see if there was any indications that there were certain entities or organizations that were intent on doing harm. The FBI couldn't look at that because it didn't have a predicated case. When 9/11 happened, the big commission finding was there were dots out there and they weren't connected. Well, what the commission didn't tell you, and should have, is the law didn't allow those dots to be connected, period. FBI agents working on a group that was committing crimes in New York, and they had intelligence about that group also involved in terrorism or other types of terrorist activity, they couldn't share information. They could not talk to each other. They couldn't share FISA warrant information with that collected off Title IIIs, which are the criminal type of intercepts. So there was an intentional legal blockade of our own counter-terrorist activities in the United States. And there's right now a review of some of those activities, and I have to say that there's been a very poor job of defining the whole thing about the telephone situation and the metadata that is being collected and how it's being used. And I think that's very useful, that there should be an understanding on the part of the public as to what this is focused on, how it should be used, and what the limitations ought to be, and there certainly ought to be limitations. Well, I guess the important thing is now that terrorism is, of course, a national priority, not just a domestic priority. It is probably the most important thing on the president's plate right now, other than perhaps the renewal of the hostilities with Russia. And we as a society need to come to grips with actually how we're going to deal with this. And you don't let an organization like Al-Qaeda exist, and we could have cut it off and stopped it in Afghanistan when we had the chance. We didn't do it. And certainly with the Islamic State or ISIS, we have an opportunity to take them out, and we're doing airstrikes. Airstrikes are great. I'm a former Marine pilot. I'd love to be flying them. But the fact of it is that you got to have the boots on the ground, at least the operators on the ground, to take charge of the rabble, put them into a cohesive unit, and go after these tyrannical beasts that are out there that are not even human. They're not even human. And you say, well, you shouldn't demonize your opponents. Well, we didn't. They did. So the point of it is that as a society, as a nation, we have to deal realistically with the problem. Now, right now, our president, our attorney general, our vice president, national security advisor, even the CIA director don't allow the use of the word Islam or jihad or any of the other descriptors that accurately define the threat that we face, because they think that's discriminatory. Well, the discrimination is when they commit their acts. That's the discrimination. And I've never gone through in my entire career where we couldn't name, we talked about Italian organized crime. Well, we didn't call all Italians organized criminals. We had the Jewish JDL, they were Jewish terrorists. We didn't say all Jews were terrorists. The same thing with Irish mobs and so forth. You use descriptors that define the group that you're going after, and it's not discriminatory as long as that's what you're focused on. But by the fact that our young agents and young intelligence officers cannot even utilize the descriptors that they use on themselves to try and define and analyze and critique the information, I think puts us at a great disadvantage. So when you find that information comes through on memory, it is what they're saying. There's no debate about it. It's what they're saying. And you can't ignore that, particularly when they come up and say, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood is the way. In the United States, we make the Muslim Brotherhood our partners. Well, the Muslim Brotherhood has been, and Frank will get into this, I think, has been the principal architect for the jihadist activities that we face in the United States and globally. And of course, we saw what happened when they did get in office in Egypt, and 36 million Egyptians, the largest group in the history of the world, came together and threw them out and brought in General Sisi, who had been appointed by Morsi, the president that had been elected after the elections that took place there. And of course, Sisi saw what was happening, and finally they took charge and put the entire cabinet and most of the operational people in that government in prison, and they're being tried. And they have listed the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist sponsoring nation, as have Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and some of the other Gulf states. We tried to talk them out of that. Well, Sisi didn't put up with that. And he says, I know what they are. I've dealt with them. You haven't, or you won't acknowledge it. So I think that this is a very good time for Frank to come in and give you a sort of nitty-gritty on what we're facing in the way of the activities of the various terrorist organizations that are operating quite freely and sometimes almost openly in our society, and even more so in Europe, and why there is an aura of protection over much of what they have and are doing that shouldn't be there. So with that, and I know we're going to answer questions later, so we will be listening for what you have to say.
Ken Emanuelson, I asked to give you all just a few words. Frank is going to actually put the whole wrap-up that comes along here. Ken was out in Garland that night. He was in the lockup. And as soon as he figures out how this high-tech stuff works, he's going to be up here.
Special ops guy, doesn't he?
You got to switch it on there.
You on? There you go. Yeah, can you hear me?
There you go.
Now there we go. Oh, okay. Yeah, okay, so We had some excitement last weekend. Is there a volume on this? I don't know if we can all have sound. Anyway, okay, so yeah, we went to the event, and as we were going in there, I was actually, Katrina and I went there. Hey, where's the volume? Oh, okay. Because I don't think we were playing. Oh, there we go. Okay. Is that better? Okay. All right. So we're going in there, and Katrina had ridden with me, and she almost didn't go because she had a, she was going to be out of town, but she ended up being in town, and so I called her up, and so we ended up going. So as we're walking in there, you know, obviously high security. Thankfully, the Garland Police Department and the authorities took it very seriously, as they should have, as it was right for them to do. And I turned to Katrina and I said, you know, this could go badly. I mean, this could go very badly. And she turned to me and she said, well, as good a day as any. And we just kind of shrugged and walked in there. But we knew where we were going, and we knew the kind of people that we're dealing with. We've been involved in this for a long time. So we went in there, and we had the event, participated in the event. It was actually mostly not particularly eventful for most of it. I mean, it was a good event. We got to see the art. And by the way, if you guys haven't seen the art pieces, there's all these stories out there. Oh, it was this offensive art. It was insulting to Muslims. It's nonsense. I mean, the art was not. If you've seen the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, Charlie Hebdo is a satire magazine. They insult everybody, and that's what they do. But the art pieces that were chosen for this Geller event were actually they were direct, but they were not insulting. They were not offensive to anyone who that has half a brain. But they did make strong statements. And the winning piece, if you haven't seen it, if you're on my Facebook, you can go look. It's in the banner to my Facebook, and it's been out there. You can look at it and find it if you Google it. But it's just a picture. It's a black and white drawing of a bearded man, and he's got a knife raised up, and he says, "You can't draw me." And then you can see a pencil and a hand at the bottom, and you see a voice bubble that comes off and says, "That's why I have to draw you." And that's the statement: is that when we're faced with this kind of response, there's really only one response to that, and that is to do the thing that you're being told you can't do. Because if we allow people to draw those boundaries around us, next thing you know, we want to do things we can't, and so we have to push back. Your rights are always under attack. So we went through the event. Geert Wilders spoke. As you may know, he's probably gotten more death threats than just about anybody in the world right now. And he was the keynote speaker. Of course, Pamela Geller, she's probably the second most death threats of anybody. And then we heard from the winner of the contest, a man named Bosch Boston. Now, this is something that's actually gotten lost in a lot of the news coverage, but Bosch Boston is a former Muslim. He was brought up and raised Muslim. And he's a talented artist, and he uses his art to speak out about, you know, the need for individual freedom and individual rights, even to push back. And so he won the contest with he's the one that did that pen and ink drawing I told you about. So he spoke. And so the event went through, and we all were kind of wrapped up, and then we were milling around and talking to each other. And I noticed that the security guys had come in through the side door, moved up on the stage, subtly but quickly, and spoke to Pamela and to Robert Spencer and to Bosch Boston, and they were hurriedly moved out of the room. And having done event planning, I had a pretty good idea what was going on, that there was something up. There had been a threat, or there was something going on. And so I found a few of my friends that were there, and we kind of got them together in an area where there were other police officers. And then I went to the front door to see if I could learn anything. And just as I was getting to the front door of the venue, the room, police officers were coming in quickly, and the one that came up to me says, "Well, nobody's leaving, we're on lockdown, nobody's going in or going out." And he says, we'll give you some information here very soon when we've verified some things, but for right now, we're on lockdown, everybody's staying in here. But we didn't know. we didn't know if there'd just been somebody called something in, or, who knows what, bomb threat. We didn't know, at that point, we didn't know that anything had actually happened. But by that point in time, there actually had been the shootout. Probably by that point, both of the attackers were dead or close to dead. But we didn't know any of that at the time. So for all we knew, it was just a threat. Not too long after that, the SWAT guys came up to the front and told us that there had been some shooting, there had been an exchange of gunfire, and I don't think we knew at the first round that a police officer or a security officer had been hit. But we learned that not too long afterwards, that a security officer had been shot. And we didn't know, but they didn't tell us it was a fairly superficial injury, it's not in the internal organs, so we didn't know. I mean, we didn't know if he was in grave danger. We were very concerned about that. And not long after that, they moved us into the auditorium. And by the way, I just want to make it very clear to everybody, I think everybody that went to that knew exactly what could happen. I don't think anybody was shocked by that something happened. And I've heard news stories about, everyone was so shaken and they had to huddle together and, sing to calm their nerves. It's nonsense. Anybody that was there, that we were in high spirits. We did not. We weren't cowering together. We were in good spirits. The only time there was actually a pall on the group was when we had heard that the police officer had been hurt, and we didn't know. We thought perhaps he'd been mortally wounded, and we said prayers for him. And that's actually when we sang. You may have seen the video where we sang "God Bless America" and some other songs. But that's what we were doing, was we were actually trying to show our support for the law enforcement that was there doing their job. But that's nonsense. Anybody that tells you that we were terrified, or this, everybody went there knowing what they were in for, what could have happened, what we also knew, we could tell that the law enforcement they were taking it seriously. I mean, the guys that were closest to us were in military uniforms with body armor and AR-15s and headpieces and comms like this. So they were serious. This was not Marty Five with a single bullet in his revolver. These guys were serious, and they were keeping us informed and doing us a very good job of that. And I can't say enough good things about the Garland Police Department. They did a very good job. And we stayed there for a while, and then we were later evacuated to another facility because the FBI and some of the law enforcement wanted to talk to us one-on-one, and so we went to a different place. But it was obviously an inconvenience. I didn't get home. I had planned to go to that from 5 to 7 p.m., and we ended up getting home around midnight, so a little longer than we had expected. But I would do, I did a number of interviews afterwards, and I was asked, well, would you do that again? And I went, yeah, I'd go tomorrow. Because I went there for a very specific reason, and that was to show my support for free speech. And I happen to agree with Pamela Geller that we have to push back on this. But if there was a different event, and the message I perhaps don't agree with, I would still stand up for free speech. Because the cure for speech you don't like is more speech and better speech. And so I stood there and I would go back, even knowing the risk, because if we don't take a stand, if we don't, gird our loins and get into the fray, we're gonna wake up one morning and we're not gonna have that much freedom left every day. There are efforts to push back and constrain your freedom. If we don't take a stand and we don't take some risks, we'll learn that they're gone when we most need them. So, is that kind of the
internet right now is our next step.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the internet. I heard Obama saying, we really need to work on Fox News and change the way they report. Well, it's kind of scary, I can imagine he does want to change that. Thank you, Russ. Just sit over.
Then the last presentation is going to come from Frank Gaffney. A lot of you know Frank, maybe some of you don't. Incidentally, who's is this? Does this belong to somebody? Does? Ah. Yeah. Frank is the founder and president of the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C. It's a nationally and internationally recognized resource for timely, informed, and penetrating analysis of foreign and defense policy. He is also the publisher and associate author of Sharia, The Threat to America, It has an introduction by former CIA Director James Woolsey, New York Times bestseller Andrew McCarthy, and Lieutenant General Harry Soyster, as well as contributions from a 19-member team that's sort of a who's who on this deal. It provides a comprehensive and articulate second opinion on the official characterizations and assessments of the threat of political Islam. It compares and contrasts mightily with the Obama administration's version of reality. And finally, Mr. Gaffney is the host of Secure Freedom Radio. It's a nationally syndicated radio program heard weeknights throughout the country, as well as being a weekly columnist for the Washington Times, townhall.com, and newsmax.com. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Frank Gaffney.
Thank you, Mike. Is this on? Hello? It's on, but I guess I need to power it up a little bit.
It's that one.
Can you hear me? Not terribly well. What's gonna do about that? Is there any way to increase it? That's what I was told about the other one. Yeah, okay. Good evening. Thank you very much for having me here. I just can't say enough about Russ and my friends Buck and Ken as well for allowing me literally to parachute in on this event at their expense somewhat, at least in terms of the time. I'm going to try to make it up to them by stitching together some of the things, as Buck said, that have already been touched on, and also some of the things that we haven't talked about yet, but that I think you need to know about this enemy we're confronting. What it's up to, and what we can do about it, at least in a couple of illustrative examples. There we go. The theme is Jihad in America. We're going to talk a little bit about what it is, first of all. You've had a fair dose of it here in Texas, as you may have noticed. I'll come back to the most recent example, but this, of course, was the dude who shot 13 of his comrades to death, and a number of others were very badly wounded. It's gratifying that at long last it's been recognized that they deserve the Purple Heart, and were given it. But notwithstanding that, I believe it's still officially designated as an act of workplace violence. There's this gentleman. I don't know how many of you remember him. He didn't actually pull off an attack that he had in mind doing on a skyscraper down on Ross Street here in Dallas, but only because he decided to buy his explosives from Buck's friends. And that was not a good plan. Also, perhaps unnoted by you, back in 2013, this gentleman who associated himself with Hezbollah, an Iranian terrorist organization, as Buck mentioned, and his idea was he wanted to get into a sensitive position in the U.S. government to wage jihad against us. And then, of course, there's this. This is down outside of the building where Ken and the company were assembled. That's what was left after the car, I believe after they blew it up, thinking that it might have explosives in it. This is in Texas, folks. Right here in River City, as they say. But I want to talk to you about another kind of jihad. Because bad as this is, I think there's something that in a way is worse. And Ken sort of alluded to it a moment ago. The technical term for it in certain circles is civilization jihad. What's meant by that? Well, it's the term of art of these guys. As Buck said, the granddaddy of all modern jihadist operations is this group, the Muslim Brotherhood. And interestingly enough, back in 2004, Buck's team got a search warrant after a providential traffic stop and went into a house in Annandale, Virginia, not far from where my wife Marisol and I live, and discovered in a secret sub-basement 80 banker boxes worth of documents that turned out to constitute the archives of the Muslim Brotherhood in North America. One document of which was introduced by Buck's team into evidence in the Holy Land Foundation trial right here in Richardson was this, the explanatory memorandum on the general strategic goal of the group in North America. Now, interestingly enough, today, a former New York Times correspondent and Pulitzer Prize winner by the name of David Shipler has just published a book, literally out today, called Freedom of Speech. The irony will not be lost on you if I describe what he's talking about, but in this book, he goes to great lengths to try to suggest that this is really much ado about nothing, this explanatory memorandum. It was found in some basement, written by some unknown person. Nothing could be further from the truth. And in fact, federal judges, 4 of them in total, both at the district level and at the appellate level, confirmed the validity of this document and the convictions that were handed down of 5 jihadists, and I'll come back to them in a moment, in the largest terrorism financing trial in U.S. history. What's particularly striking about this particular document, which was a strategic plan for the Muslim Brotherhood in North America, was this mission statement. It described the mission of the Muslim Brotherhood in North America as a kind of civilization jihad, aimed at eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within, by their hands and the hands of the believers, so that God's religion is made victorious over all other religions. That's what these guys are up to. And it turns out that it wasn't just some coot who had written this. It was a top Muslim Brotherhood operative by the name of Muhammad Akram. He wasn't writing it just for his own amusement. He certainly wasn't writing it for our edification. He was writing it as a progress report to the mothership in Egypt, telling them how they were coming with this civilization jihad aimed at destroying America from within. And it is a fascinating document. We have made copies of it. What do I do with those copies? I guess they're over here. Do I have copies of the book right there? Ken? Yeah, Ken's holding it. If anybody would like to see it, it's available online for free at securefreedom.org or for a couple of bucks at Amazon. What's fascinating about it is it walks you through how a stealthy, clandestine, covert, seditious operation works in a place like the United States of America. These are examples of how you put your operatives into positions that they're able to influence or perhaps actually shape American government policy. You try to silence freedom of speech. You use other techniques like getting inside our educational system. You have here a lady who is all over this and who can tell you more about it in the course of the evening. You try to get it inside official jurisprudence in our court system. You go after other civil society institutions like the faith community. And you get inside the business community, the capitalist system, with something called Sharia compliant finance. These are illustrative examples. I'm going to give you some of how this is playing out in Texas. These are 6 individuals who've been prominent in the Obama administration. You may recognize this as Mrs. Anthony Weiner, also known as Homa Abedin. And by the way, she's back. She had private emails on Mrs. Clinton's server. She was also one of the people who decided which of the private emails on Mrs. Clinton's server were actually government property and which should be destroyed. She's a top, I believe, maybe not top, but certainly an accomplished Muslim Brotherhood operative. He's been with Mrs. Clinton for about 15 years. I don't have time to go through all of these tonight, but I'm just going to focus on this guy because his story is illustrative of how this works. He's a homeboy, folks, right here in Plano. His name is Mohammed Elibiari. In fact, I had the privilege with Scott Franklin of visiting with Mr. Olivieri at a conservative luncheon here in the Park Cities Club. But his day job is running something called the Freedom and Justice Foundation. That may sound familiar to Mohammed Morsi's party in Egypt. That Muslim Brotherhood party was called the Freedom and Justice Party. He's big on guys like Anwar al-Awlaki and the Ayatollah Khomeini. Despite that, he managed to get a couple of gigs here in Texas with the Department of Public Safety on their advisory committee, for example. He also managed to parlay that into a gig with the federal Department of Homeland Security. The same people that Buck was just telling you about think that the only problem we really got is people are being so beastly to Muslims in this country. Well, where do you think they're getting that kind of stuff? From a Muslim Brotherhood operative like Mohammed Olivieri. This is an interesting data point. Shortly after he got on that advisory committee, he gets a security clearance. What does he do with it? Almost immediately, he goes into the database to see if he could make the case that your former governor, then running for president of the United States, was actually an Islamophobe. But unfortunately, after Buck left the system, people made some rather dubious judgments about people like Mohammed Olivieri, including the former director of the FBI, Robert Mueller. He decided that he would give Mr. Olivieri the highest civilian award of the FBI. Where did he give it to him? At the FBI Training Academy in Quantico. What else is at the FBI Training Academy? Well, the FBI Library. What turns up in the FBI Library, according to a radical leftist by the name of Spencer Ackerman, who writes for Wired magazine? Well, materials that were offensive to Muslims. Several days after this appears, the ACLU, you may be familiar with them, a rabidly leftist organization that endlessly is associating with and enabling the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists. They write to Mr. Mueller, along with Olivieri, of course, saying, you really got to purge all of those offensive materials from your training documents, and also the trainers who use them. On October 19th, not satisfied with that, 57 groups, leftists on the one hand and Islamists on the other, write to John Brennan, who at the time was the president's Homeland Security advisor, saying, it's not enough that the FBI purge its files and training materials of this kind of hateful material. We want the military, the intelligence community, and the Department of Homeland Security all to do the same. And on November 11th, John Brennan agreed. He is now the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So when Buck Revell gets up and he tells you that our government refuses to use terms like jihad or Muslim or Sharia or the like, this is where it comes from, folks. This is part of it. It goes back to what Ken was talking about. You're not allowed to know this because not only is it offensive to Muslims, and not all Muslims, of course, but the ones that are easily offended, which typically are the ones who recognize this is counterproductive to their program of civilization jihad. I'm not going to leave you with just the Mohammed Olivieri example of what's happening here in Texas in terms of civilization jihad, but rather give you just a few other examples. I mentioned the Holy Land Foundation, as did Buck. These were the 5 co-conspirators found guilty in Richardson, Texas, of funding Hamas. As I said, the largest terrorism financing trial in U.S. history. Let me just drill down for a moment on Mufid Abdul Qadir, chap on the far right. He turns out to have been the most successful of these characters, partly because he did a rock band thing, singing songs glorifying jihad and calling for martyrdom in the name of its program. Interestingly enough, 2 facts to know and tell, he's the half-brother of Khalid Mashal, the leader of Hamas. Also, there's this. For 8 years, he worked on your city government's payroll as a city engineer, prompting one of Buck's colleagues to say to the then mayor, this could be a problem for the district, for the city of Dallas, because he's had detailed technical information about your critical infrastructure. You have, and I believe this is probably wildly out of date, it's about a year or two old now, but 59 mosques in this area. Not all of them are problematic. Unfortunately, some decidedly are. Like the mosque in Phoenix, where those two guys who tried to shoot up Ken and his colleagues emanated from. They are Islamic societies or Islamic cultural centers. They typically have their mortgages held by a Muslim Brotherhood front group called the North American Islamic Trust. How do we know the North American Islamic Trust, also known as NATE, is a Muslim Brotherhood front group? Well, one clue is this handy little memo to the Muslim Brotherhood headquarters. Says it was one of their groups, as it's put here, one of our organizations or organizations of our friends. In fact, this is something, interestingly enough, the Saudis are not coming to Camp David for the summit. Did you hear that? The Saudi government actually has the North American Islamic Trust as a line item in their budget to fund the purchase of mosques, because when you own the mosques, what do you get? You get the imams. You get the pedagogy for the madrasas. You get the choice of what goes into the libraries, what goes into the bookstores, and so on. So the mosques are part of the infrastructure. They actually describe them in some of their more direct characterizations as arsenals. You're familiar with this case. I actually was in a little town 2 hours east of here, and this guy's face was up on a billboard because the FBI is still looking for him. He killed his 2 daughters in something known as an honor killing. It happens here in America, folks, including right here in Texas. And then there's this. I was talking to this lady about the Gulen movement. You may know them better as the Harmony Schools, of which there are at last count, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, 146 or so. Excuse me, 46. These are operated with taxpayer funds. They're a little bit more clever than just overtly describing themselves as promoting Sharia. Instead, they promote Turkish nationalism, because this character, Fethullah Gulen, is formally a Turkish imam, but for reasons that may have something to do with what you were describing as the Clinton doctrine, during the Clinton presidency, this guy was allowed to come and set up shop, his multi-billion-dollar empire of not just schools, but construction companies and other lines of work, from an armed camp in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. But these schools are operating right here. Many of them are characterized as STEM schools. They are used to get inside our educational system and promote, yes, Turkish nationalism, but with it as the subtext, the wonders of Sharia. You may know this lady. She is the mayor of Irving. She has come up against the civilization jihad, aimed at establishing the first Islamic tribunal in the country, with the explicit purpose of it becoming a model for Islamic tribunals all over the United States, akin to what they now have in Britain, which is 87 of these that operate side by side with English common law courts. They also, interestingly enough, and we've just done a little booklet on this subject if you're keen on this, been trying to bring Sharia into our court systems as well. And I'll come back to that here in a moment. Let me just conclude this brief description of what we're up against by just telling you what the ultimate dot connector is. It's something called Sharia. As Russ mentioned, we've done a book on it, actually several. You probably are aware that it does in fact have something to do with religious practice. Some estimates say about 10%. But the rest of it, that 90%, isn't about religion. It's about political, military, and legal regimens that are meant to govern absolutely every aspect of a Muslim's life, and because it is the obligation of adherent Muslims under Sharia to impose it on everybody else, it's meant to govern your lives as well. These are some of its traits that are best known. This guy's getting off light, he's just getting flogged. Typically for minor infractions, you'll lose a limb, or a nose, or ears, or female genitals, because this is a pretty bad thing for women. But this is really the ultimate program. This is about, as I say, Islamic supremacism and imposing this program worldwide. That is the object and purpose of the Muslim Brotherhood and that of every other jihadist in the world. It is really about power, not about faith, which is good news because that means, I think, we can do something about it. But unfortunately, this is the unyielding reality. They're obliged to try to get us to submit to it, and they are told that jihad is the way to do that. Where you can, following the model of the perfect Muslim, through terrifying violence, because that's how Muhammad did it. But if you can't, if you're not strong enough, if the other, the infidel, the local power is too strong, you also do what Muhammad did when he was relatively weak. And that is you use other techniques, stealthy or civilization jihadist techniques. So what do we do about it? I just want to give you a reference to a course that we've put together. Some of you are familiar with it. It's called Muslim Brotherhood in America. And it's a 10-part series. It's available for free at this website, MuslimBrotherhoodInAmerica.com. It talks at length in the 10th part about what you can do as individuals, what you can do as members of groups like the Tea Party, what you can do as citizens of our country. 4 examples of specific things that we can do. Michelle Bachmann, alas, is no longer with us, in part because she actually had the temerity to stand up against this so-called political correctness or willful blindness and challenge it. One of her last efforts as a member of the House of Representatives was to introduce legislation calling for us to designate the Muslim Brotherhood for what it is, a terrorist organization. We need to get that legislation enacted. In 9 states so far, we've had American laws for American courts adopted as a response to, specifically, the threat posed by Sharia, but more generally, the problem of foreign law of any kind that violates our civil liberties under our Constitution or public policy. We're trying to get this through the state legislature here for the 3rd time. And once again, I believe the same guy that you heard about earlier, Speaker Strauss, is blocking its consideration, at least on the floor, in the House of Representatives in Austin. It's making progress in the Senate, which is farther than we've ever gotten, but we should sure use your help on this in the final push. Coming to Ken's point, can we try to run that video? There is a concerted effort being made by the Islamists in various ways to try to begin taking us down by formally restricting our freedom of speech. And I'm hoping that the Meister here will be able to pull up a short 30-second video that we've done that kind of makes this point. We're going to need sound. Stand by. See if the library network is up to this. Let me just say by way of introduction, it's not just the violent jihadists who went shooting up Garland the other day who are trying to restrict our freedom of speech. It's not just Mohammed Biari who's trying to restrict our freedom of speech and ability to know what we're up against. There is actually a group that you probably have never heard of, which is all the more extraordinary because they are arguably the most powerful multinational organization in the world today. This is only 30 seconds, so we got to get it from the beginning.
It's illegal to shout fire in a crowded movie theater, unless there actually is a fire. Then you have to do it to save lives. Jihadists are trying to stop speech that they find offensive. But even if some Muslims are offended, telling the truth about jihad and Sharia will save lives. So you have to do it. See something, say something.
See something, say something, of course, being a familiar refrain. It's just that we're not allowed to see, or certainly not allowed to say, things about this problem. So I just want to conclude on this thought. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation is a 56-nation organization. They rounded up to 57 by throwing Palestine in, but I'm a stickler for things, and that one doesn't count as far as I'm concerned. But because they're so numerous, and because they basically have more money than God, your petrodollars at work, these nations are able to dominate what is done at the United Nations these days. And one of the things that they've been doing doggedly for 10 years is promoting a so-called plan of action whose purpose is to try to formally prohibit speech worldwide that defames or otherwise offends Muslims. And the Obama administration, as one of its first acts on the international stage, in March of 2009, just barely in office a month, was to embrace, endorse, and co-sponsor a resolution in the Human Rights Council of the United Nations to do just that. And speaking of Hillary Clinton and Homa Abedin, this was one of her priorities. In fact, you may famously remember, she said at one of the meetings of something called the Istanbul Process, which she co-chaired with the leader of this Organization for Islamic Cooperation and the European Union, was in light of this sort of natty problem of the First Amendment, wasn't necessarily going to be possible for us to actually prohibit speech that gives offense to these guys. But we're going to use, she said, quote, old-fashioned techniques of shaming and peer pressure, unquote, to try to prevent that kind of hateful speech from being made. Well, this sounds to me a lot like what Pam Geller has been exposed to for the past 10 days. Shaming, peer pressure. So, just a closing thought, and we don't have time to get into this, but I would love to talk with you about it. There is a danger of a kill shot that these Islamists, or for that matter, other enemies of this country, know they can take. They could take down the country, possibly with a single bullet, if you would. It's our grid, our electric grid. It's very vulnerable. We actually have had some, I'm sorry this is off the edge here, but we've had some progress made here in the state legislature. Bob Hall, right here in the Dallas area, has been a leader. I just have to tell you, this is another of those providential things. We discovered in Austin about 2 months ago that Senator Hall happens to know more about this problem of our vulnerability to things like electromagnetic pulse than practically anybody in the country, let alone in the state legislature. I'm not sure that his legislation is going to see the light of day either because of what's happening in Austin these days, but he's trying manfully. And Tan Parker is also helping on the House side, and I salute both of them for their efforts. With that, I will leave you. We're using the brand Secure Freedom these days. If you'd like to know more, securefreedom.org is where you'll find us. Thank you very much for allowing me to go.
let's pull the chairs up, and while you're doing that, I want to remind those of you who are regulars here, we've already discussed several of these topics in other places and in other ways. Some of you may remember that our own Congressman Pete Sessions recently put out a paper praising the Harmony schools and talking about how fabulous they are for our community. Now, fortunately, some of our members were outraged about this, and they went and they sat down with Pete, and according to them, Pete claimed he had no idea. He was absolutely stunned and amazed. He was shocked, Captain Renault. Anyway, we'll see if we get any more like that, but I don't think we will. But this thing kind of goes on all the time around us. We've seen it partly in the amnesty fight. You know, there is a very clear connection now between the Muslim Brotherhood and our own U.S. Chamber of Commerce through the delegation thing that they have established in Doha, Qatar, which is the original home of a lot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they too have amnesty as a priority. And of course, the National Chamber is the largest funder in Washington, D.C. I think they did $139.6 million of funding to various groups in 2012. Just to put $139.6 million in context, that will compare pretty favorably with Google, which did $5 million. So you can understand the stroke that the National Chamber has in this relationship they've been building with Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood since 2010, started in Doha, has got to be very, very concerning. And the last thing I would say that sort of was an interesting perspective, and one of you all sent this to me and I appreciate it. There's a great article out by a fella, and I'm probably going to include it in the materials we send out, and he's really talking and putting the whole Pam Geller deal in context. He said, isn't this really Martin Luther King's Selma? He saw what they were forbidden to do, and he said that's where we've got to go, and that's what we've got to step into. And good Republican that he was. And so today, this is really very much what we saw. We saw this whole thing take place out at Garland, where clearly the Muslim Brotherhood was running that operation back, I think it was January 7th or thereabouts. And it was all about how we were not allowed to say things and what the restrictions needed to be on people about all this. And that's what prompted Pam Geller to say, that's our Selma moment. That's where we need to go be. And as Americans, we need to be doing this all the time. This is really what Frank is talking about. Okay, having made those few little points, everybody's gotten settled here. Let's take some time, and if someone has questions. Actually, I have the first question. I have the first question. We have just seen an interesting news article. Seymour Hersh, famous author, has said that he doesn't believe the account of what happened to Osama bin Laden. And I would just be curious if any of you gentlemen would like to comment about that. And it's open to whoever would like to. All right, there we go.
Seymour Hersh hadn't written the accurate column since he lied story that got into Pulitzer Prize. Over and over and over, when I was in the Bureau, we found him making up and certainly fabricating and expanding information that was inaccurate. We'd face him with it, and he'd just say, shrug his shoulders and say, so what? He feels like he can't be challenged, and I wouldn't believe a word he said. In this case, I stand with the White House press secretary, says, well, he's just full of it.
I have a slightly different view, not on Seymour Hersh, but I have the feeling that there is a piece of this story that has not been properly described, and that is the decisive role played by the President of the United States. My gut tells me that he was playing golf right up until the moment where they thought it sufficiently far along to bring him in, and everything else before that had been basically run by his subordinates because they knew they couldn't trust, well, maybe him, but certainly Valerie Jarrett who had canked this deal repeatedly in the past.
Well, the point I'm talking about is the SEALs actually carried out the operation. There was no Pakistani involvement. In fact, you couldn't trust ISI in any circumstance. And I don't know what went on in the White House, but I do know those SEALs and how they operate, and that was what I was talking about.
Good. All right, next question. Right.
Russ, in you guys' opinion, how bad has Obama dismantled our military?
Well,
Can we include military and intelligence?
yeah. I'm happy to defer to Buck on this, as he's actually served in uniform. I just was on the civilian side of the Pentagon. But I will tell you, I think we're looking back at the hollowing out of the military by Jimmy Carter as the good old days, compared to what's being done now. And for a couple of different reasons. Partly because Jimmy Carter was dealing with a much larger military when he started dismantling it than what we have now. Jimmy Carter was dealing with a military that was relatively modern. My old boss, Ronald Reagan, came in and really kick-started its complete overhaul. But he was able to do that. This is really, in a way, the critical piece. He was able to do that relatively easily because the infrastructure, the industrial base was there. It was a question, kind of a plant that's in need of watering, getting some water. The root structure is all there, and it blossoms again once it gets the water. We've been pulling the plant up by the roots under this administration, and I'm sorry to say, in part, it's been a function of congressional action as well as executive branch action. This sequestration thing has been devastating. But lastly, you throw on top of all of that a kind of social experimentation that has been designed, I believe, to destroy the military. Yes. Destroy its unit cohesion, destroy its good order and discipline, destroy what has made it the most admired institution in the country, the integrity, by bringing in, everybody on up to transgender individuals and putting women in ground combat positions, where, by the way, most of them don't want to be. And under this arrangement, they will be forced to be there, I'm afraid. And for all these reasons, I think that the next president is going to find it much harder to turn this around. And it's probably true in spades on the intelligence side, but I'm not as familiar with how bad it is there. Maybe, Buck, you want to comment on the counterintelligence side? I'm pretty sure it's desperate straits.
The counterterrorism side has not suffered. The FBI has been funded. They have supported the ongoing investigative activities other than defining what they could look at. So the FBI has not, but other elements of the intelligence community have been essentially diminished significantly. And the interface between the military and the intelligence community and the law enforcement community is sadly lacking in enough resources to do the job. So we as a society, as a nation, have got to decide we're going to step up and meet the challenges and do it forthrightly, and unfortunately that hasn't happened.
These civilized jihadis like Mr. Mohammed, who's visited the Park Cities Club, so forth, has he been called out? Does he get the same credibility that he has had in the past as he does?
Yeah, in the interest of time, I took out a couple of slides. He apparently overstepped even for the Obama administration, and they did not re-up him on this advisory committee when he announced on Twitter, it's big on Twitter, that the reestablishment of the caliphate, this is after the unpleasantness with the Islamic State, was inevitable, as he put it. The good news is he's off the advisory board. The bad news is in one of his tweets, he announced that what he was now going to be devoting himself to was to ensuring that the GOP won in 2016. So I direct you to Scott Franklin to take questions on Mr. Elibiari and why he is in the conservative meeting at the Park Cities Club. But I will just tell you, he's just one example. I showed you 5 other folks. And they're just illustrative examples. There's a detailed dossier on each in our course, but that barely scratches the surface. There's one that, I don't know if you caught it, but he was in kind of a turban type thing by the name of Mohammed Majid. Mohammed Majid is a close personal advisor to the President of the United States. Mohammed Majid was, until very recently, the president of the largest Muslim Brotherhood front organization in the United States, the Islamic Society of North America. It's the number one on that list in the Muslim Brotherhood's explanatory memorandum. This is a man who has deeply penetrated the government, is a go-to guy on everything. Get this, I say this in the course. I learned, as I was putting this thing together, that one of the things Majid pulled off was that the night the president was about to make the second of those two Muslim outreach speeches, you remember the first one was in Cairo in June of 2009. The second was at the State Department in May of 2011, I believe. The night before, he brings Mohammed Majid into the White House to presumably go over the speech. And interestingly enough, you may not remember all the details, but you probably will remember this, because I'm sure it was as jarring to you as it was to me. This was the speech that the president made in which he announced, as part of his outreach to the Muslim community, that the United States henceforth was going to insist that Israel go back to the 1967 borders, which are also known as the Auschwitz borders, because they are indefensible and would assure the destruction of the state of Israel. I don't know whether that was Mohammed Majid's contribution or whether he simply thought it was a great idea. But either way, this is the problem that Michelle Bachmann and Louis Gohmert from here in Texas and 3 other members of Congress were rightly concerned about and were excoriated for pointing out.
If I may, let me follow up on what Frank said, because I was at the luncheon. I was at the luncheon that Frank attended and spoke, and then I was also at the following luncheon. Excuse me. And so Frank gave a very good rundown. It was a little bit different than what he presented here, but basically alerting us to the problem. He talked a little bit about what Grover Norquist has been up to, and again, there's a lot to cover, so any presentation is going to be a little bit limited. But essentially, Frank laid out a lot of the same material that he laid out here. And in the following meeting, the organizer of the conservative, this is a group that calls itself Conservative Alliance, the organizer stood up and said, I just want to clarify what Frank said. Everything that Frank said is either a product of maybe a little bit of mental instability, or he's just lying to you, because there's no basis, no factual basis for anything that he told you last time. And he's been confronted with this, and he keeps spreading these stories. And I was very offended that if that was really your feeling towards Frank, then why not, give him an opportunity to respond. Don't wait till he's on the plane back to Virginia and then come in front of us and tell us that you don't think anything he said is it. But I mean, it was really at that point that he was either crazy or a liar. And so I reported that back to Frank, and we actually talked about it. And Frank actually ended up coming up with a dossier that backs up everything that he's presented. And they continue to deny it. If you take this to Grover Norquist right now, and you say, what about all this stuff? He'll say, I'm not responding to bigots. I can't hear you. I don't know what that is. You're being hateful. You're being racist. You're being bigoted. I'm not going to respond to you. And he actually, finally, I understand Glenn Beck brought up enough of this that he felt compelled. But then he went on to Glenn Beck, and I listened to some of it. I know that Norquist was just lying about things. And he gets away with it, and you know why he gets away with it? Because of the money. Because there's dollars attached to all of this stuff, and so all of these little nonprofit groups, they're always scraping around for money. Well, guess what? Big Daddy Grover can show up with a big checkbook and write checks. And that's what's going on. And I've seen the checks. And you can find them online. They then say, Islamic Bank of Saudi Arabia, made out to whatever group. This is what's going on. Your conservative groups, your supposedly red, white, and blue Republican groups, are being bought and paid for. And if you're not aware of this, and I'll ask Frank to respond to that, but I've seen it. I've seen the evidence, and I think that Frank will confirm a lot of that.
Well, let me just, because some of this may be it was horrifying to me, I have to tell you, and I wouldn't frankly believed it myself, except I wound up sharing office space with Grover Norquist for 7 years. And a month after we moved in, one of my colleagues came to me and he said, you know, there's a Muslim Brotherhood front organization on the other side of the Xerox room, which we shared with Grover Norquist. So I had 7 biblically long years to watch this process. So I will just tell you that what was going on was that a top Muslim Brotherhood operative, not Muhammad Akram, but one of his friends, by the name of Abdurrahman al-Amudi, set up a Muslim Brotherhood influence operation to go after us, conservatives, the Republican Party. I mean, there was no Tea Party at the time, but it was us. And it worked. And again, much of the course that I just encourage you to take a look at deals with this in detail. If you're interested, the dossier that Ken encouraged us to put together, Judge Michael Mukasey, the Attorney General of the United States under George W. Bush, Jim Woolsey, the Director of Central Intelligence under Bill Clinton, and a whole host of others lent their names to this. And I believe Glenn Beck has in fact validated it all. If you're interested in sort of highlights of what he's come up with, again, go to securefreedom.org, it's there. But the point is, folks, these are serious people engaged in a calculated, comprehensive, disciplined, and patient takedown of our country. And anybody who would tell you that they must not, in their penetration and subversion operations, have targeted people like us, who actually were kind of instrumental in beating the last totalitarian ideology that tried to destroy us, is out of their mind. And just to bring this back to this story, I wasn't there, as you said, for the follow-on to this, which was, by the way, said on the authority of a woman who has been covering for Grover Norquist in Washington. You may have heard of her by the name of Cleta Mitchell, attorney in Washington. But I turned immediately after Muhammad al-Diarra. I frankly weighed very long and hard whether to actually go right for his throat, which would have been my inclination, but I thought maybe people in the room would have taken it amiss. So I didn't say anything specifically about him. I just hoped that all of the other things that I said along these lines would draw him out, and I kept looking at him out of the corner of my eye, and he was white-knuckled. But he didn't say anything. He got up and he left at the end. And I turned immediately to this guy, the host, and I said, having, again, explicitly described the nature of the Muslim Brotherhood, how it's operating, what it's targeting, the fact that with Grover Norquist's help it is going after conservative movement and other similar Republican organizations, I said to him, why do you have a Muslim brother in this meeting? And as interesting as what he said, really, was what he didn't say. He didn't say, who are you talking about? He didn't say, what evidence do you have that he's a Muslim brother? He said, quote, he was recommended to us by the center-right coalition, unquote. Now that may not mean anything to you, but having shared space with the center-right coalition headquarters in Washington, D.C., I can tell you that was proof positive of the kind of influence operation that is being run, not just back there, not just with the Pete Sessionses and other federal officials, but here in Dallas and all over the country by Grover Norquist and his operation. So forgive the long-winded reply to that, but it was an important point. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Folks, I want to thank you all. Finally, hallelujah, welcome aboard. This is nothing new. I'm Jewish, and this is as old as Ishmael. The beginning of time. So thank God that you're finally getting to see the light. I was at the Holy Land Foundation trials every day. I was the only one without a burqa. I was with Ken at the event in Garland. Several years ago, we had an event at the Hyatt Richardson. I don't know if many of you remember going to that. immediately put together within 24 hours a program at the GOP headquarters to alert people of the fact that there was a major event at the Hyatt Richardson where they was securing funds to secure lobbying for Sharia law in our Texas legislature. And the guest speaker was Tariq Ramadan, whose father started the Muslim Brotherhood. So this is nothing new. I would like to just simply ask you all, just as they built 5 new mosques immediately after the Muslim Brotherhood trials to show we are here to stay, let us all please insist that the American embassy be moved to Jerusalem and not Tel Aviv, the capital of Israel.
I want to share, thank you, Daniel. I want to share one thing real quick. You know, a lot of these guys have names that sort of tip you off that they might be on the other side. But a lot of them don't. And the pernicious influence of money is stunning. I actually have a home in our neighborhood that is very, very close to mine. And it was bought several years ago by a gentleman, and didn't really know who he was. One day a suitcase showed up at my front door, American Airlines, the lady was coming, and she wasn't there and had lost her bag, and so American wondered if they could leave it at our front door. And so we said sure, and pretty soon guy comes over and gets it, walks back, very patrician, good looking kind of guy. Come on, David, quit here. And he showed up, it wasn't you though, I recognize you. I recognize you. And so I got curious and I jumped on the internet to see who now owned the house. And then I was curious who it was. And what I found is that he lives in Zurich most of the time. He runs a Sharia-compliant fund. Now, a Sharia-compliant fund, in case you don't know, have to give a certain percentage to terrorism. He would show up once or twice a year. Black car would pull up in front, he'd get out, wheel his suitcase in. 48 hours later, the car would pull up, he'd wheel his suitcase out, and he'd be gone. You'd see him, you know, that was the activity every 6-8 months. The rest of the time, he was always gone. And then, of course, one day, about 6 guys showed up, and they were all very large, swarthy gentlemen. There were about 6 black cars out in front of his house, all of which had brand new dealer tags on them. And I mentioned to Kathy, I said, you know, it's about to get interesting here. And groups started coming in, and we would see them out in the backyard Saturday morning, laptops flipped open, having big meetings. And then one day coming home, I noticed a car was parked on the wrong side of the street about 2 doors down with a person sitting in it. And in a prior life, that sent off a few bells in my head. So I walked into the house and I said, Kathy, it's about to get really interesting. And she said, well, what are you talking about? I said, well, let's see. Sure enough, the next day I came home, same car, 2 doors down, wrong side of the street, person sitting in it. And I went into the house and I said, well, we're going to have a visitor here shortly. She said, really? What are you talking about? Doorbell rings, right on cue. It's the lady who's been sitting in the car, just 2 doors down. She says she is from the Census Bureau. And she's been sort of waiting to see if our neighbor came home because he hadn't filled out his census form. Really? I was going to mention that was probably because this wasn't a census year. But, you know, go with it, right? So I said, well, you know, what can I tell you about him? Well, you know, who was there? What did I know about him? Blah, 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 blah. I said, well, if you got a card, if I see him, I'll be glad to notify. So she gave me her card. I went in, called up a buddy of mine who was probably someone that Buck Revell may have run into at some point or another. Said, what about this telephone number? It's supposed to be the Department of Commerce. He calls me back in about 30 minutes and he said, "It's not the Department of Commerce."
Oh my God.
I said, that's kind of what I was thinking about. And then about a week later at 3 in the morning, the SWAT cars and SWAT team showed up and they took everyone out. And that was, you'll love this part though. The local patrol guy said, "Well, you know, we weren't really sure what they were doing. They said that the party got out of control." I said, "They need the SWAT team. This is a party I missed." Anyway, the fella who lived in Zurich has evidently now retired and is now living full time next door. All of his swarthy friends are gone. But they're here. They are here, they live among us, they look just like us, and it's all about the money. And you just have to get over that and realize that, and then you begin to see a whole lot more around you that makes sense. It's why some of our Republican leadership, quite frankly, appears to be on the wrong team. And we just have to realize that too. Incidentally, I did do a little research, and I noticed this Zurich gentleman gave large amounts of money to the NRCC and the NRSC in 2012. Isn't that interesting? Okay, sorry. Ira, what you had your hand up and then you.
Well, firstly, where can I get one of those infidel hats that the Garland police were wearing? Paul Garland. It's not under the Patriot Act, reading it carefully, or the Wahhabi mosques, especially those in Richardson and North Texas. I've had more than one confrontation with some of those people out there. And are they not terrorist organizations under the Patriot Act? And two, I've read the Quran at length, and I've seen nothing peaceful in it. I see only one Islam, and the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th amendments are kill the mushrikin, kill the infidel. And the 35th commandment is kill the mushrikin, kill the infidel. So I'm just, when people say peaceful Muslim, or when George Bush says Islam rules the peace, it's just beyond me. He hadn't read the book. Anyhow, I'm just wondering what you thought about the Wahhabi mosque being terrorist organizations under the Patriot Act.
Well, one of the things that is great about this country is that we have a Constitution and we have a Bill of Rights. And that guarantees that the government, including the FBI, can't just walk in and accuse any entity, irrespective of the concern about it, as being a subversive or a terrorist organization. You may well be right, but the FBI has to go about it just like I opened the case on the Holy Land Foundation when I was agent in charge here in Dallas in 1992. You see how long it took after the passage of the Patriot Act to actually bring that group to trial, because we have to be very concerned about the protecting of the rights of all individuals, irrespective of how you might feel about them. And there is no blanket authority to go in and cover anything just because it's Muslim. In fact, the New York City Police Department is facing a significant lawsuit to diminish their capacity to even run informants in the mosque at this point. So we have a system of law that applies to everybody. It makes it difficult to go in to organizations that are covered by the First, Second, and Fourth Amendments and the Fifth Amendment. So, yeah, there are those operating out there that eventually will be found to be involved in illegal activities amounting to support of terrorism. But until that evidence is produced in court, they are still open and able to operate in the United States.
Let me just add a point to that. One of the reasons why I tried to emphasize this notion that Sharia is kind of the fault line between Muslims that are a problem and Muslims that aren't a problem is because it is fundamentally about power, not religion. Because it's fundamentally seditious, not protected religious practice, we actually can do things about it. Now, Buck's absolutely right. Even before this crowd came in, with all of its willful blindness and well, sympathies for these folks. Even the Bush administration, and most especially the Bush administration in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, which goes back to the influence operation that I believe Grover Norquist was instrumental in helping to advance, which contributed to precisely the point that you're talking about. You remember that George W. Bush early on after 9/11 came forward and said Islam is a religion of peace. Jihad is about personal struggle, not holy war. Things like the people who are hijacking these planes are trying to hijack a great Abrahamic faith. Where do you think he got that stuff? I believe he got it from the Muslim brothers who were brought in to advise him so as to assure that he wasn't inadvertently creating a clash of civilizations by pushing back, by going after the people who brought down that building, as he famously put it. So that's point one. We're dealing with a sophisticated and sustained, as I said, disciplined influence and information operation. And the more we succumb to this notion that we can't talk about this, or we can't give offense, or we have to really self-censor or shame people who are not, the more this becomes insuperably hard to address the real and present danger, whether it's under the Patriot Act or whether it's under any other of our laws. As to your other point, there actually are passages of the Quran that are peaceful, revelations from God that were tolerant, particularly towards people of the book, Christians and Jews. It's just that unfortunately, not only are they not all that numerous relative to the ones that aren't tolerant or peaceful or calling for you to love the people of the book. It's that, as my wife is fond of pointing out, there is a principle of Sharia that is absolutely central to what we're up against, which is abrogation. Basically, what comes after replaced what came before. So all of those peaceful, loving, tolerant passages happen to be from the early part of Muhammad's trajectory in Mecca, and were replaced explicitly by God by things that were better, that were revealed to him when he became powerful and a conqueror when he was based in Medina. So it's not that they're not there, and interestingly enough, I've had a conversation with one of your prominent citizens here in Dallas about this over dinner one night. And his son was in the room. And he took exception to what I just said. And I asked if you've been studying, various religions in college. He said, oh yes. And I said, was one of your textbooks on Islam a book called the Quran, the early passages? And he said, yes. And what's interesting about that, folks, and it goes back to what I was talking about, and as you know so well, the penetration and subversion of our academic institutions has been the playpen of the left for decades. But the Islamists have figured out how to get in there too. And one of the most insidious ways of doing this is with this book that only talks about the early passages and makes no reference at all to the fact that they have been abrogated or that they're even accompanied by things that are completely contradictory. And that is, I'm afraid, contributing to the next generation's blindness or what they perceive to be the need for tolerance in the face of this present and growing danger.
This gentleman in the back had his hand up. Yes, sir.
I've got a question for Ken, but I'd like to make a comment first. Russell started the meeting talking about the Convention of the States. There is in Austin right now a bill being presented under Article 5, which is what that refers to, which enables the states to amend the Constitution. And I think all these problems we're talking about today has to do with the fact that the 17th Amendment changed the way senators were elected.
Yeah.
And that's why these people can advance. That's why issues can be discussed in ways that don't seem to have any resolution, because there's coverage in the U.S. Senate that allows it to go on. Principally, I'll end real quickly, Russell, because when that happened, allegiance to the party became more important than allegiance to the states that used to send the senators there. And I just want to say, take a look at that Article 5 offering that's in Austin right now. Think about the Convention of the States, and think about the fact that if we don't change that, we'll play whack-a-mole. Whack-a-mole. Forever, to our most likely detriment. Question for Chuck?
Okay.
Were you allowed to go armed into that meeting?
No, the venue has a rule against concealed handguns.
I would have felt a lot better going if I did. Anyway, thank you for letting me make a comment. Article 5, Convention of the States, Amendment 17 of the Constitution. Repeal it.
The bill that he's referring to down there is HR 77, HJR 77, yeah. Just a second.
Real quick, one of the things that we've seen in education is the shift away from academics to changing the next generation's attitude, values, beliefs, and behaviors. And my question, I thought it was interesting when you were speaking earlier about how, you know, per Obama, the intelligence community is not allowed to use certain words, jihad. Are you seeing new recruits into the intelligence community with a shift in worldview? Is it already gone down, or do we have people coming up? Is that an issue, the education of the intelligence community?
There's enough old timers around that have been there and seen it, and when the agents get out of the academy, they go out and learn what the real world's about. And these are the kind of people that took down the whole operations here. Obviously, they know the real score. And irrespective of what the director said, or when I was the deputy director, what I said, and I tried to be real, and by the way, Bob Mueller is a real guy. I mean, he's a solid person, but they are constrained right now. But the agents, when they get out in the field, they know what they're going after. And they are still learning from their more seasoned seniors. But sooner or later, that pipeline draws up. And if we don't turn it around pretty quick and start saying, if it's a fact, we deal with it. We don't gloss it over, we deal with it. And there's no political correctness about going out and ascertaining a factual situation and dealing with it on its merits. And that's what FBI agents and CIA operatives have to do.
Could I make two quick points on this?
Yeah.
One is, you know, what Buck has just said, I'm sure it's true, but make no mistake, the suppressing influence of official policy on senior leaders and then on down the ranks is real, and it is having an effect. I don't think there's any question about it. And a point that I'm given to make is that, you know, when we describe that as political correctness or as multiculturalism or as diversity, sensitivity, what have you, our enemy has a different term for it. They call it submission. And when they see us doing it, however we dress it up, their doctrine, their DNA tells them redouble the effort to make that enemy, that infidel, feel subdued. That's the Quranic injunction. So this doesn't get better the more we try to accommodate. The second thing is, and it's going back to what I was concluding my remarks with, which is what do we do about this? We are mounting, with help from our friends, something we're calling the counter-jihad campaign. A critically important part of which is trying to train people who can no longer get training in these sorts of areas within their official regiment. A colleague of Buck's, I don't know if you actually knew him, I think you've gotten to know him since you left government, but John Guandolo is one of those who is doing this. Very, very gutsy guy, vilified by David Schiffler's new book, but nonetheless out working with sheriff's departments, working with military officers, intelligence personnel, police officers and the like, to try to make sure they have the kind of knowledge that Buck's talking about, which they have to have if they're to protect us, period.
Jan?
Russ, there are those of us in the room that take exception with Article 5, the Constitutional Convention. We don't obey the Constitution as it is now. We don't obey it. And so what makes us think if we go into it and mess with it, that we will then? Also, you look at the political climate of the country. We are in such turmoil in the country. How can we ever come to an agreement on it? So, and there are a number of other reasons why not to do it. It's very, very dangerous to tamper with our Constitution.
Well, why don't we, yes, keep it short. I just want to take advantage of these gentlemen here, and really this isn't
Just
quite.
so everyone knows, founders designed senators to be sent to Washington from the state senate houses. You had to first be elected in your state senate or representative. Now, 100 years ago, we passed an amendment that repealed that and basically changed how they were sent. Now senators are popularly elected. And all I'm saying is go back to the way it was, or at least impose term limits, because the reason people can advance these issues that these gentlemen are talking about is because they have political coverage. And there would be no coverage for a senator from Texas who had anything to do with that, or any other state. Obamacare, for example, would never pass unless they had the endorsement of the state that sent them there. And that's all I'm saying is break that connection.
Yeah, if I may make a suggestion, it sounds like we need to have a debate on Article 5 convention, and this probably isn't it, but we should have one in a future meeting.
Yeah.
And so maybe we can hold those comments to a next meeting when we would be talking about that topic.
I'm glad to hold it
utilize
for the
these
next
guys by
meeting,
asking
but I
questions.
definitely stand on the side of the danger of the constitutional convention.
Yeah, I think we should maybe have that event later, that discussion later.
A commission of the states or anything else. If they start messing with it, you can't control who's going to be your representative. You can't make him pledge 100% that he's going to do what you say he's going to do. And the dadgum well ignore the current constitution, income, whatever you want to say. If you don't obey the Constitution, what good is changing a few words and then opening it up to a very dangerous process?
That's
Okay.
right.
All right, well, we'll look at having a debate about it next time. Let me get Larry, he's had his hand up here and you did.
If anybody like to comment, it is that demographers might say that just passage of time may not be kind to our American way of life. If we just examine the Muslim birth rate versus birth rates of other groups, including Hispanics, that at some point, America may become a Muslim country.
Well, I'm not a demographer by any means, but it's my understanding that if it weren't for the infusion of Hispanic immigrants to this country, our birth rate relative to the Muslim population would be comparable with Europe. And it's not working out very well for them. I would just make one other quick point. I think I mentioned a little reader that we have on Sharia in American courts. We have another one that's just out about the refugee resettlement program, which is a whole nother kettle of fish. I don't know if you focused on that. Texas is a place where a lot of these folks, and overwhelmingly they're Muslim. Now, why is that? Unbelievably, It's because, going back to what I said about that Organization of Islamic Cooperation and its influence in the United Nations, we have actually contracted out the decision as to who is a refugee for admission to our country, to the United Nations. And not surprisingly, given the role that the OIC plays in it, it turns out almost all of them are Muslims. And it's not that that's a problem necessarily. It's just that when you're, for example, taking them from refugee camps run by Al-Qaeda in Syria or the Islamic State, you're probably going to get more of the jihadists on the wrong side of that Sharia fault line than the benign ones who want to assimilate and be part of the American dream.
Is that not part of the civilized jihad?
It is part and parcel of it. In fact, it is a tradition going back to Muhammad's own life. That trajectory that I was talking about before, where he moved from Mecca to Medina, it's called the Hijrah, or the migration. And this is part and parcel of the program. Under Sharia, the traditions of the faith, the Hijrah is a kind of colonization to move populations into non-Muslim nations for the purposes of turning them into Muslim nations. Yes, that is underway. Yes.
Has that been wrapped up under Obama?
I believe Laura Ingraham used the number the other night on O'Reilly's show that there's something like 1.9 million Muslims who've been brought in since 9/11. I think that has been ramped up. I believe at about the rate of 100,000 per year. And if you want to know what it looks like, look at Al-Shabaab's operations in Minnesota at the moment, where they're threatening to blow up the largest mall in the country, the Mall of America, sending guys back to kill in there, presumably to come back here.
And if you, just a word of advice, if you want to see parts of Europe, sooner is probably better than later, because, and I'm not joking, I mean, it continually neighborhoods become a place where somebody like you or I would not be safe. And so, and it's happening fairly quickly.
Okay, we're running short of time. We've had 3 people I know with hands up for a little bit. So let's go David, and then this lady, and then gentleman back there in the t-shirt. Let's try to get these 3 questions in here. Yes, David?
Texas is getting a disproportionate number of the refugees. Does the state have no say in that? Is there no way to counter that distribution?
As of now, the way this works is they're not even generally told it's happening. They're just dumped here. Ann Corcoran is the author of this little monograph. You may have seen her. She's getting a lot of play now. Again, it's available for free online at securefreedom.org if you want to take a look at it. She got engaged in it because she was a housewife in Hagerstown, Maryland, who didn't know anything about any of this. And suddenly 60 Turkic Muslims turned up, unbeknownst to the local authorities, without any plan. The sinister piece of this, I must tell you, it makes me a little cynical, is that the agents for depositing these people are 9 contractors, 6 of whom are basically leftist, religiously affiliated entities. Yep. Catholic bishops, Lutherans, Methodists, Jewish group, Baptists. These entities are paid by the head to deposit people in communities. As I say, there's, if any planning, it's generally concealed from the communities themselves. And if they object, generally the government, gets heavy with it. There's now a new program, you'll love this, called the New Americans Initiative. These aren't, not just these people who are coming in legally. The illegal aliens are now not aliens. They're new Americans. And this is going to be reinforced, I think, with a lot of government, federal government action. But the good news is, as Ann has pointed out, where the public gets engaged, where they can find out about it, where they can get spun up about it, generally it causes the whole process to get gummed up. So we need to know about it and we need to engage.
These refugees, they all become citizens. That's part of it.
They can very quickly get green cards and become citizens. They immediately get access to all of the entitlement programs.
Right. Yes, ma'am.
I met you when you spoke not long ago, and Beth Van Dyne's my mayor, and she know in Irving, though we were so proud of that I was to speak up as she did, it was so disturbing, like those Supreme Court decisions that are 5-4, and you think, what's wrong with the other 4? Well, our city council approved the idea of ALAC being, passed in our legislature. It was only a 5-4 vote. Well, I don't know how many, as I said, I live in Irving, and just this weekend, one of those votes she lost. And so a different man, David Palmer, has been elected. And when he was running and I got his flyer in the mail, I called the number on there and he answered. And I said, the neighborhood I lived in, and I see you're running, and I said, and it was place 8, it was citywide, excuse me. And I asked him, and he has a law degree and all these things, which we now know don't be impressed just by, as Carla Fiorina would say, titles, but what does he really think? And I said, well, Mr. Palmer, I would like to ask you, what are your thoughts about the Sharia law tribunal in Irving? And he went, well, first of all, there isn't one. And so at that moment I thought, well, you certainly, now I know I wouldn't want to vote for you, but he did win. And so I just was going to ask you, I ended up speaking to him quite a long time, and at first he was very condescending, and he began to say, we have the best legal system, blah, 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 and I said, you're arguing my point. That's why we shouldn't be consulting foreign law about anything. And he was acting like, none of this has happened and we're fine, and I mentioned you, and of course he didn't have any idea who you were, and I said, well, are you aware that Sharia law cases are already decided in America? And at least he listened when he talked, but he was just convinced that this wasn't even a problem. And what would you say, like if I give him your websites and things like that, because now that he's my councilman, he needs to know, or he's already been bought and paid for and he's lying about it.
It's an excellent question. We would, of course, be happy to help support you in briefing him, or at least getting him a copy of this little booklet, which talks about, I believe, 10 cases here in Texas in which a judge ruled that Sharia should be used to adjudicate a matter. So, I mean, this is not a hypothetical. This was this particular study had 146 around the country, and this is just a small sample of American jurisprudence, mind you. But I believe the speaker is saying the same sorts of things. That, this isn't a problem, we don't need to have this kind of legislation. I believe this is partly probably a function of ignorance, but there is the danger that, he has found that it's politically better to be on the other side, in which case this has to be fought. I'm so sorry to hear that, because I think, as you say, that was a very close call, and Beth is a remarkable woman, and I commend to all of you her as a real leader in this field. In fact, we're honoring her in New York on the 22nd of June.
This gentleman in the green t-shirt.
Yeah, there are known training camps in this country right now for these jihadists. I know one personally down southwest of Houston. Knowing that they exist, why aren't these being taken out? And second, what is being done now, and what more can be done to keep these idiots out of this country in the first place?
Well, I think a lot of the resettlement issues and immigration issues, and obviously the program we were just talking about, are very problematic and need to be examined very carefully. As far as weapons training and firearms, I can't really comment on that except to say, if they break the law, I would be looking over their shoulder if I was them.
Well, on Buck's first point, one of the things apropos those refugees from Syria that I mentioned a moment ago, some of your colleagues were testifying before the Congress that they have no way to vet these Syrian refugees to establish whether they are jihadists or not. I started to say one of the things that makes me a little cynical about this is when you have these left-wing church groups making common cause with Islamists and dumping large numbers of these folks in districts like, Michelle Bachmann's, or Louis Gohmert's, or Trey Gowdy's. I wonder if it's a coincidence that all of those people just happen to be the kind of guys that these folks would not like to be in office. I don't think so. And it seems to have dawned on Trey, maybe that's the case too, because he's fired off a 17-question letter to the State Department, raising some real concerns about this. We'll see. He's chairman of the Immigration and Border Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee in the House, and he's a fairly tenacious guy, so I'm hoping he'll stay on the case, if only for personal political survival reasons. But apropos the second point, there's a very interesting film that was done a number of years ago. It's a very low production value operation. It was done by a group called the Christian Action Network. And it's about an organization called Muslims of America, or Jamaat ul-Fuqra. And this is an outfit that was established by a sheikh out of Pakistan by the name of Jelani. And that name may not mean anything to you, but it was Jelani that Daniel Pearl was on his way to see when he was kidnapped and executed. Jelani is captured in this film speaking in a training video that somebody in law enforcement gave the producers, which is just breathtaking, because he says in his own words, he is creating a world-class terrorist training infrastructure in America. And by some counts, they have some 30 of these camps. I don't know if this one in the outskirts of Houston is one of theirs or not, but it probably is. But they've got them in lots of places, and they're not, as a general rule, located in uninteresting places, shall we say. And I suspect the ship channel in Houston would be an interesting place to have a terrorist operation. I know of another one, I think I can never remember if it's in Georgia or in South Carolina, but it's in close proximity to a nuclear power plant down there. In fact, I'm told, this is a little dated, but I'm told that some of the personnel from the Jamaat ul-Fuqra camp are employed as maintenance personnel and janitorial staff in the nuclear power plant. But get this, some of the women in the camp drive school buses in the community. Now, one of the other features of this particular group, which is another problem, it's not just these imported jihadists that we have to worry about. There is an active program of recruitment and indoctrination of converts. Specifically, one of the things that's particularly worrying to me, I must tell you, is that even though the guy who put Grover Norquist in the Muslim Brotherhood business, Abdurrahman al-Aboudi, is now serving hard time in federal prison himself on terrorism charges. Before that, before the Bush administration, the Clinton administration was very interested in this guy. So much so that they made him a goodwill ambassador to represent us to Muslim countries. They made him an advisor to the Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations. But they also gave this guy, for the first time in our history, the opportunity to recruit, to train, and to credential chaplains for the United States military and the U.S. prison system. And as far as I can tell, none of those guys has been said, you're no longer ministering to these populations that, let's face it, you don't want converting to jihad. But a lot of the guys in the Jamaat al-Fuqra camp are people who converted in prison to this program. So it's a very worrying thing. Why aren't they being shut down? I think, unfortunately, Buck is no longer in the FBI. And one of the things that is attested to at several points in this film by the Christian Action Network guys is they talked to law enforcement. They even talked to the FBI, as I recall, and they were told that they were not going to go into those camps. You didn't use the term camp, but in Europe, they've come to be known as no-go zones. Well, that's effectively what these things have been.
But if we know what's going on.
If you know what's going on, people in the local community are hearing automatic weapons fire, they're hearing explosives all hours of the day and night. All I can tell you is I think this is the kind of ticking time bomb that we have in this country, not of the civilization jihad in this case, but of the pre-violent program of old-fashioned.
Which turning a blind eye to it's gonna bite us in the ass.
We are. Here's, if I may, just last point. It turns out that there is some interest in this community, I take it, from several different perspectives, in your elected representation. I'm not taking sides in this particular fight. I just would say that anybody who wants your vote ought to be asked about these questions. And the reason we're here is to inform you, equip you, to make sure that they're doing their job. Willful blindness is going to get a lot of us killed. We can't afford it anymore.
Just a real quick point, I've been told by law enforcement that investigating or taking too much of an interest in that is a career limiting move, and which is a euphemism for you're going to get fired or you're going to never going to rise through the ranks if you take too much interest in that stuff. And I don't know if Mr. Revell can.
Not during my term, it wasn't.
Well,
Okay, well, we have sort of arrived at that time. There are some other events that I would tell you at the bottom of this. If you have signed in, if you're not on our mailing list and want to get some of these materials, please do and give us your email. And if not, we stand adjourned and thank you very much. Let's have a hand for these folks.